They laughed when she picked up the rifle. After all, Isabel Miller was just the girl who served coffee and sandwiches at the military shooting range. At 23, with flour still dusting her apron and hands that smelled of fresh bread, she was invisible to the soldiers who passed through the cafeteria daily. But when that range officer handed her a weapon as a joke, thinking she'd fumble and drop it, something shifted. What happened next would force an entire military base to question everything they thought they knew about potential, preparation, and the quiet determination of someone who'd been underestimated her entire life. This is the story of how a cafeteria worker became a legend. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out, subscribe now for more. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Riverside Military Training Facility as Isabel Miller pushed through the heavy doors of the base cafeteria at 5:30 a.m. The air inside still carried the lingering smell of yesterday's cooking, mixed with industrial cleaner and the faint metallic tang that seemed to permeate everything on a military installation. She tied her apron with practiced efficiency, her movements automatic after 18 months of the same routine. The breakfast shift started at 6, which meant she had 30 minutes to prep the coffee urns, arrange the pastries she'd baked the night before, and set up the serving stations that would feed 200 soldiers before their morning training exercises. Isabel had taken this job fresh out of culinary school, thinking it would be a stepping stone to something better. Her dreams had been bigger ones. She'd imagined opening her own restaurant, maybe in Vienna where her grandmother had run a small bakery, or perhaps in London where the culinary scene was vibrant and diverse. Instead, she found herself serving scrambled eggs and toast to soldiers who barely looked at her as they moved through the line. The cafeteria was her domain, but it was a small domain. She knew every inch of the industrial kitchen, could navigate it blindfolded. She knew which oven ran hot, which refrigerator had a temperamental seal, which cutting board had a slight warp that made dicing onions more difficult than it should be. But beyond these walls, she was nobody. Just another face in a support role, invisible to the people whose lives revolved around weapons training, tactical exercises, and combat readiness. The first soldiers began trickling in at 5:50, earlier than usual. Isabel recognized most of them by sight, though few knew her name. There was Lieutenant Brennan, who always took his coffee black with 2 sugars. Sergeant Hutchins, who complained about everything but always came back for seconds. Private Davies, barely 19, who still got homesick and appreciated when Isabel added extra cinnamon to the oatmeal because it reminded him of his mother's cooking. "Morning, Miss," Davies said as he approached the counter, his voice carrying the soft accent of rural Scotland. "Smells brilliant in here today." "Fresh cinnamon rolls," Isabel replied with a smile, using the tongs to place 2 on his tray. "Just out of the oven." "You're a saint, you are," Davies grinned, his face lighting up in a way that made him look even younger than his 19 years. These small interactions were the highlights of Isabel's day. Brief moments where she felt seen, where her work mattered beyond just fulfilling a function. But they were fleeting. As soon as Davies moved down the line, she was invisible again, just hands serving food, a fixture no more notable than the coffee urns or the napkin dispensers. The morning rush lasted until 7:30, a constant stream of hungry soldiers fueling up before heading to various training exercises. Isabel worked efficiently, her hands moving in practiced rhythms as she served, restocked, and maintained the flow of the breakfast service. By 8 o'clock, the cafeteria had mostly emptied, leaving her with the cleanup that would consume the next 2 hours. She was scrubbing down the griddle when she heard the conversation that would later seem prophetic. 2 officers had lingered over their coffee, their voices carrying across the empty cafeteria. "The qualifying trials are next month," one of them said. "Captain Foster, if Isabel remembered correctly. Command is pushing for higher standards this year." "About time," his companion replied. "Half the recruits can barely hit a target at 100 meters. We need marksmen, not people who spray and pray. The range has been booked solid for weeks. Everyone's scrambling to improve their scores before the trials." Isabel listened while she worked, not because she was particularly interested in shooting qualifications, but because any conversation was better than the silence of an empty cafeteria. She'd never fired a gun in her life, had never even held one. Her world revolved around recipes and serving schedules, not rifles and target practice. After finishing the morning cleanup, Isabel had a brief window before lunch prep began. She usually spent this time in the small office behind the kitchen, reviewing inventory and planning menus. But today, restless energy drove her outside into the morning sunshine. The base was sprawling, a complex of buildings and training facilities spread across several hundred acres. Isabel's route to the small bench where she usually took her breaks led past the rifle range, a long open area bordered by earthen berms and covered firing positions. She'd walked past it hundreds of times but had never paid much attention to what actually happened there. Today, something made her pause. The range was active, with a dozen soldiers spread across the firing line. The sharp crack of rifle fire punctuated the morning air, regular and rhythmic. She watched from a distance as instructors moved behind the shooters, offering corrections and adjustments. There was something almost meditative about it, Isabel thought. The careful positioning, the controlled breathing she could see even from this distance, the moment of absolute stillness before each shot. It reminded her oddly of pastry work, of the precision and patience required to create something perfect. Admiring the view? Isabel jumped, startled by the voice behind her. She turned to find Range Master Kowalski, a gruff man in his 50s who occasionally came through the cafeteria line. His weathered face carried the permanent squint of someone who'd spent decades in the sun, and his uniform bore the insignia of someone who'd been in the military longer than Isabel had been alive. "Just taking a break," Isabel said quickly, feeling like she'd been caught somewhere she shouldn't be. "I didn't mean to." "Relax," Kowalski said, his tone gentler than his appearance suggested. "You're allowed to exist outside the cafeteria, you know. Even civilians are people." The word civilian carried a weight Isabel had felt since starting this job. It marked her as separate, other, someone who didn't quite belong in this world of uniforms and hierarchy. She was support staff, necessary but not valued, present but not included. "Have you ever fired a weapon?" Kowalski asked, nodding toward the range. "No, sir," Isabel replied. "Never had a reason to." Kowalski studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You know, some of the best natural shooters I've ever trained were people who came to it late. No bad habits to unlearn, no preconceptions about how it should feel." Isabel wasn't sure how to respond to that, so she simply nodded. Kowalski seemed about to say something else, then shook his head and walked toward the range, leaving Isabel alone with her thoughts and the distant sound of rifle fire. She returned to the cafeteria with the conversation lingering in her mind. It was strange, she thought, how a few words could shift your perspective. She'd never considered that the skills she valued in herself, the patience and precision and attention to detail that made her good at her job, might translate to something completely different. The lunch shift was busier than breakfast, with soldiers coming in staggered groups between training sessions. Isabel moved through the familiar routine, serving pasta and roasted vegetables, refilling drink stations, responding to requests with the same pleasant efficiency she'd cultivated over 18 months. But something had changed. As she watched the soldiers pass through her line, she found herself seeing them differently. These weren't just people who needed feeding. They were individuals who'd mastered skills she couldn't imagine, who'd pushed themselves beyond limits she'd never tested. And they did it all while she remained safely behind her serving counter, comfortable in her small domain. The afternoon brought a lull that Isabel used to prepare for dinner service. She was rolling out dough for tomorrow's bread when Sarah Chen, another cafeteria worker, burst through the kitchen doors with the kind of excitement that usually meant gossip. "You'll never believe what happened at the range today," Sarah announced, dropping her bag on the counter. "Davies nearly shot himself in the foot." "Well, not really," but Foster was furious. "Said if people can't handle basic weapons safety, they don't belong in uniform." Isabel continued working the dough, her hands moving in the rhythmic pattern she'd learned from her grandmother. "Is Davies all right?" "Oh, he's fine. Just embarrassed. But it's got everyone talking about the qualifying trials next month." Apparently, command is considering stricter standards. Anyone who doesn't meet the minimum might face reassignment or even discharge. This caught Isabel's attention. They can discharge people for not shooting well enough. Not exactly discharge, but they can deny promotions, reassign you to less desirable positions, basically stall your career, Sarah explained, washing her hands at the large industrial sink. For someone like Davies who wants to make the military his life, it's serious. Isabel shaped the dough into neat rounds, placing them in proofing baskets with practiced precision. She thought about Davies's face that morning, so young and eager, and felt a pang of sympathy. How crushing it must be to have your dreams threatened by something as specific as marksmanship scores. You ever think about learning to shoot? Sarah asked suddenly. The question surprised Isabel. Why would I? I don't know, Sarah shrugged. We work on a military base. Seems like something we should know, doesn't it? Like first aid or how to change a tire. I suppose, Isabel replied, though she'd never considered it before. Her skills revolved around feeding people, not weapons training. Though I can't imagine anyone would want to teach cafeteria staff how to use rifles. Probably not, Sarah agreed, laughing. Can you imagine? Sorry, can't serve lunch today, we're all at the range learning to be snipers. They both laughed at the absurdity, but the thought lingered in Isabel's mind as she finished her prep work. What would it be like, she wondered, to step outside her comfortable role? To try something completely unfamiliar, something that people associated with strength and courage rather than service and support? The dinner shift passed in its usual blur of activity. Isabel had developed a kind of meditation in the repetitive work, finding peace in the rhythm of serving and clearing, in the satisfaction of efficiently feeding hungry people. But tonight, her thoughts kept drifting to the rifle range, to the controlled precision of those shooters, to Range Master Kowalski's comment about natural talent. After her shift ended at 8 p.m., Isabel walked to her small apartment just outside the base. It was a modest place, a studio that she tried to make homey with plants and cooking equipment that far exceeded what the kitchenette required. She'd been saving money, planning for that restaurant she still dreamed of opening, though the dream felt more distant with each passing month. She made herself a simple dinner, pan-seared fish with roasted vegetables and a glass of white wine, and sat by her small window overlooking the base perimeter. In the distance, she could see the lights of the rifle range, still active even at this hour. Soldiers dedicated to improving, pushing themselves, refusing to accept limitations. Isabel thought about her own life, about the comfortable routine she'd settled into. When had she stopped pushing herself? When had she accepted that serving food was enough, that her dreams needed to be practical rather than ambitious? The questions felt uncomfortable, like prodding a bruise she'd learned to ignore. The next morning began like every other. Isabel arrived at 5:30, went through her prep routine, served breakfast to the familiar faces. But when her mid-morning break came, she found her feet carrying her toward the rifle range again. It was quieter today, with only a few soldiers practicing under the watchful eye of an instructor she didn't recognize. She stood at the fence line, watching as a young woman, probably not much older than herself, methodically loaded and fired a rifle, each shot careful and deliberate. Back again? Isabel turned to find Range Master Kowalski approaching, a slight smile on his weathered face. I was just curious, Isabel said, feeling defensive without knowing why. About what you said yesterday. About natural shooters. Kowalski studied her for a moment. You really never fired a weapon? Never. I grew up in a small town in Austria. The closest I came to anything like this was my uncle's hunting rifle, and I never touched it. Austria, Kowalski repeated, his expression thoughtful. You know, some of the best competitive shooters in the world come from Europe. There's a precision to it that appeals to people who value accuracy over force. I value accuracy, Isabel heard herself say. In cooking, everything has to be precise. Temperatures, timing, measurements. A few degrees too hot and you ruin everything. Shooting's similar, Kowalski said. It's not about strength or aggression. It's about control, patience, reading conditions, and adjusting. The best shooters are the ones who can quiet their mind and focus on the fundamentals. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the female soldier on the range complete her practice session. When she was done, she cleared her weapon with practiced efficiency and turned to leave, nodding respectfully to Kowalski as she passed. "You know what?" Kowalski said suddenly. "We're running a basic familiarization course next Thursday evening. It's designed for support staff who want to understand weapons safety and basic marksmanship. You should attend." Isabel's heart jumped at the suggestion, a mix of excitement and terror. "I don't know if I—" "It's completely voluntary and free," Kowalski interrupted. 2 hours, very low pressure. We mostly focus on safety and letting people get comfortable holding a weapon. No expectations, no pressure to be good at it. Why are you encouraging me to do this?" Isabel asked, the question coming out more bluntly than she intended. Kowalski's expression grew serious. "Because in my experience, the people who think they can't do something are often the ones who surprise everyone, including themselves. And because I've seen you around the base for 18 months, and you've got the look of someone who's capable of more than they're currently doing." The observation hit closer to home than Isabel expected. She thought about her dreams of opening a restaurant, about the comfortable rut she'd fallen into, about the restlessness that had been growing for months. Thursday evening, she found herself saying, "What time?" 1800 hours. Meet at Range Office Building. Wear comfortable clothes, nothing fancy. As Isabel walked back to the cafeteria, her mind spun with questions and doubts. What was she thinking? She had no business learning to shoot. She was a cook, not a soldier. This was absurd. But another voice, quieter but persistent, whispered that maybe Kowalski was right. Maybe she was capable of more than serving food. Maybe it was time to find out. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative. The days leading up to Thursday evening felt interminable. Isabel found herself distracted during work, burning a batch of cookies she'd made hundreds of times before, oversalting soup that had to be remade completely. Sarah noticed her preoccupation, but Isabel deflected questions, not ready to explain why she'd signed up for weapons familiarization training. She almost backed out twice. On Tuesday, she convinced herself it was foolish, that she'd embarrass herself in front of people who actually belonged in that environment. On Wednesday, she drafted a message to Kowalski explaining that she couldn't attend, though she never sent it. By Thursday afternoon, her nerves had reached a pitch that made her hands shake as she cleaned the kitchen after lunch service. "You all right?" Sarah asked, noticing Isabel's agitation. "You've been weird all week." "I'm fine," Isabel lied. "Just tired." At 5:30, she changed out of her cafeteria uniform into jeans and a simple cotton shirt, her heart hammering as she walked toward the Range Office Building. The sun was still high in the September sky, casting everything in golden light that felt too beautiful for how terrified she felt. 6 other people were already gathered when she arrived, all support staff she recognized from around the base. 2 were maintenance workers, 1 was from the administrative office, and 3 were from various supply departments. None were military personnel, which somehow made Isabel feel both better and worse. Range Master Kowalski emerged from the office building carrying a clipboard and wearing an expression that managed to be both stern and encouraging. "All right folks, glad you could make it. This is a basic familiarization course, emphasis on basic. We're going to start with safety rules, move to weapon handling, and if time permits, let you fire a few rounds under close supervision." He led them into a classroom attached to the range office, where several disassembled rifles lay on a long table. For the next 40 minutes, Kowalski walked them through weapon components, safety protocols, and the fundamental principles of marksmanship. Isabel found herself fascinated by the mechanical precision of the rifles, the way each part served a specific purpose, how everything had to work in harmony for the weapon to function properly. It reminded her of complex recipes where timing and technique mattered more than individual ingredients. The comparison felt strange but apt, and she found herself asking questions about trigger pressure and sight alignment that made Kowalski nod approvingly. "Good questions, Miller," he said, using her last name for the first time. "You're thinking about the mechanics, which is exactly right. Shooting isn't magic, it's applied physics and practiced technique." When they moved to the actual range, Isabel's confidence evaporated. The rifles that had seemed manageable in the classroom felt heavy and intimidating in her hands. The other participants looked equally nervous, which provided small comfort as Kowalski positioned them in firing stalls with thick foam mats and clear safety barriers. "We're going to start with dry firing," Kowalski explained. "No ammunition, just practicing the mechanics of aiming and trigger pull. Get comfortable with how the weapon feels, how to position your body, how to control your breathing." Isabel settled into her assigned position, the rifle butt pressed against her shoulder as Kowalski had demonstrated. Through the scope, she could see the paper target 50 meters downrange, its concentric circles seeming impossibly small. Her hands trembled slightly as she tried to steady her aim. "Relax your shoulders, Miller," Kowalski said, appearing beside her. "You're fighting the weapon instead of working with it. The rifle wants to point naturally at the target, you just have to let it." Isabel consciously relaxed her grip, adjusted her stance, and felt the weapon settle into a more natural position. Through the scope, the target steadied, and she gently squeezed the trigger as instructed. The dry click of the firing pin felt satisfying, somehow right. "Better," Kowalski approved. Again. They practiced for 20 minutes, each participant taking turns with dry firing while Kowalski moved between positions offering corrections and encouragement. When Kowalski finally announced they'd moved to live firing, Isabel's mouth went dry. He distributed 5 rounds to each participant, explaining that they'd fire one at a time under his direct supervision. The sharp crack of the first shot from the maintenance worker 2 stalls down made Isabel flinch despite her ear protection. "Don't worry about others," Kowalski said quietly, appearing at her station. "Focus on your own target, your own breathing, your own trigger press. Everything else is just noise." When her turn came, Isabel loaded the single round with trembling fingers, her heart pounding so hard she worried it would affect her aim. She settled into position, pressed her cheek against the stock, and found the target through the scope. Her breathing was too fast, too shallow. "Slow down," Kowalski coached. 3 deep breaths. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Let your heart rate settle. Isabel followed his instructions, feeling her body gradually calm. The target sharpened in her vision, the crosshairs steadying on the center circle. She began the trigger press Kowalski had taught them, smooth and gradual, no jerking or anticipation. The rifle fired with a crack that surprised her despite expecting it, the recoil pushing into her shoulder with force that felt both violent and controlled. Through the scope, she saw the paper target ripple but couldn't tell where her shot had landed. "Check your target," Kowalski said, handing her the binoculars. Isabel focused on her target downrange and felt her breath catch. The hole was visible in the second ring from center, nowhere near perfect but far from the complete miss she'd expected. A strange pride bloomed in her chest. "Not bad for a first shot," Kowalski said, and the approval in his voice felt better than any compliment she'd received about her cooking. "The fundamentals are there. Everything else is just practice." They each fired their remaining 4 rounds, with Isabel's shots clustering in a rough group that averaged around the 3rd and 4th rings. By no means expert shooting, but consistent enough that Kowalski seemed genuinely impressed. As the session concluded and they cleared their weapons, Isabel felt something shift inside her. The rifle had felt foreign and frightening at first, but by the end, there was a rightness to it, a sense of capability she hadn't experienced in years. The mathematical precision of it appealed to something deep in her nature. "Good work tonight, everyone," Kowalski announced as they prepared to leave. "You're welcome to attend our open practice sessions on Wednesday evenings if you want more trigger time. No pressure, but the invitation stands." Walking back to her apartment, Isabel's mind buzzed with new information and possibilities. Her shoulder ached slightly from the recoil, and her hands smelled of gun oil and powder residue. She felt different somehow, like she'd discovered a hidden room in a house she thought she knew completely. That night, instead of her usual evening routine, Isabel found herself researching marksmanship online. She learned about the physics of ballistics, the psychology of competitive shooting, the techniques used by Olympic athletes. The rabbit hole went deep. And by the time she looked up, it was past midnight. The next morning at work, Davies came through the breakfast line looking dejected. "Rough night?" Isabel asked as she served his usual eggs and toast. "Practiced at the range until dark yesterday," he admitted. "Still can't get my groupings tight enough. The qualifying trials are 3 weeks away and I'm nowhere near ready." Part 5. Isabel found herself at the Wednesday evening practice session, then the next one, and the one after that. What had started as curious experimentation evolved into something approaching obsession. She bought her own ear protection and shooting gloves, invested in notebooks where she tracked her performance and noted areas for improvement. The rifle range became her second home. After her cafeteria shifts ended, she'd change clothes and head straight to the range, spending 2 or 3 hours practicing until the light failed or her arms ached too much to continue. Kowalski had given her access to the ammunition requisition system, surprised but approving of her dedication. "Never seen support staff take to this like you have," he commented one evening as Isabel methodically worked through her practice routine. "Most people try it once or twice and lose interest. You're here more than some of the soldiers." Isabel had no simple explanation for her commitment. Part of it was the satisfaction of mastering something difficult, of watching her groupings tighten week by week as her technique improved. But deeper than that was the sense of proving something to herself, of refusing to accept the limitations she'd unconsciously accepted for so long. Her scores improved dramatically. The shots that had clustered randomly in the outer rings now grouped consistently in the center. She learned to read wind conditions, to adjust for distance, to control the microscopic movements that separated good shooting from excellent shooting. The precision required felt like the culinary arts translated into a completely different medium. At work, people began noticing her absence during breaks. Sarah confronted her directly after the second week. "Where do you disappear to every afternoon?" Sarah demanded. "And why do you smell like gun oil?" Isabel hesitated, then admitted, "I've been practicing at the range. Learning to shoot." Sarah's expression cycled through disbelief, confusion, and finally amusement. "You? The girl who won't even kill spiders in the kitchen. You're learning to shoot rifles?" "It's not about killing anything," Isabel tried to explain. "It's about precision and control and pushing myself to do something I never thought I could." "But why?" Sarah pressed. "What's the point? You're not going to become a soldier." The question struck at something Isabel had been avoiding examining too closely. What was the point? She had no intention of joining the military, no practical use for marksmanship skills in her planned culinary career. And yet the hours at the range felt more purposeful than anything she'd done in months. "I don't know," Isabel admitted finally. "Maybe I just needed to prove I could." The qualifying trials were now just 1 week away, and the base hummed with nervous energy. Soldiers practiced obsessively, their anxiety palpable during meal times. Davies continued to struggle, his frustration visible every morning at breakfast. Isabel wanted to help but didn't know how. What could a cafeteria worker possibly offer to train soldiers? On the Friday before the trials, disaster struck. Isabel was finishing her evening practice session when she overheard a heated conversation near the range office. Range Master Kowalski was speaking with Captain Foster, their voices tight with stress. "We've got a problem," Foster was saying. 3 of our range safety officers called in sick. Same stomach bug that's been going around. Without proper supervision, we'll have to postpone the trials." "We can't postpone," Kowalski replied firmly. "Command set this date months ago. Half the base has been preparing. Postponing would be a logistical nightmare." "Then what do you suggest?" "We need certified range safety officers, and we're 3 short. Unless you can pull qualified personnel out of thin air, we're stuck." Isabel continued cleaning her rifle, processing this information. The weekend passed in mounting tension. Isabel heard through base gossip that command was scrambling to find replacement range safety officers, possibly bringing in personnel from other facilities. The trials were scheduled for Tuesday, and without proper supervision, they'd have to be canceled or dramatically scaled back. On Monday morning, Isabel arrived at the cafeteria to find unusual chaos. The stomach bug that had affected the range officers had spread, taking down several kitchen staff including Sarah. Isabel found herself managing breakfast service essentially alone, with only one other worker who'd been pulled from evening shift to help. The stress of running the kitchen short-staffed left her exhausted by mid-morning. But instead of taking her usual break, she forced herself to the range for a quick practice session. The rifle had become her meditation, the one place where her mind quieted and everything made sense. She was methodically working through her routine when Kowalski approached with an expression she'd never seen before. Desperation mixed with calculation and something that might have been hope. "Miller," he said without preamble. "How many rounds have you fired in the past 3 weeks?" Isabel mentally calculated. "Maybe 800? 900? I've been tracking my ammunition usage for budgeting." "And your average grouping at 100 meters? Last session, I had an 8-centimeter group. Still working on tightening it to 5. Kowalski studied her for a long moment. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before answering. The qualifying trials are tomorrow, and we're still 2 range safety officers short. I know you're not military personnel, but you've demonstrated consistent safety practices and solid marksmanship fundamentals." Isabel's heart began to race. "What are you asking?" "I'm asking if you'd be willing to serve as a probationary range safety officer for tomorrow's trials. You'd shadow me directly, wouldn't be responsible for any final scoring decisions, but your presence would allow us to maintain proper supervision ratios. It's completely voluntary, and honestly, it's irregular as hell, but—" "Yes," Isabel interrupted, the word escaping before she fully processed what she was agreeing to. Kowalski's eyebrows rose. "You might want to hear the rest before." "I said yes," Isabel repeated firmly. "Whatever you need, I'll do it." A slow smile spread across Kowalski's weathered face. "All right then. Be here at 0500 tomorrow. Wear dark clothes, comfortable boots. I'll brief you on specific duties and protocols. And Miller? Don't mention this to anyone yet. I need to clear it with command first." Isabel nodded, her mind already spinning. A range safety officer, even probationary, even just for 1 day. It felt impossible and perfect and terrifying all at once. That afternoon, she barely tasted the lunch she prepared, her thoughts consumed by tomorrow's trials. What had she agreed to? She'd be surrounded by trained soldiers, all of whom would question what a cafeteria worker was doing in a position of authority at the range. She'd be scrutinized, doubted, probably resented. But underneath the anxiety ran a current of fierce determination. This was her chance to prove she was more than her job title, more than the invisible person who served food while real soldiers did important work. Tomorrow, she'd step into a role nobody expected her to fill. Tonight, she had to be ready. Retry. CK. Proceed with Part 7, 8, 9 and 10. Make sure that each part has 600 words only. Part 7. Isabel arrived at the range at 4:45 the next morning, 20 minutes early, her stomach a knot of nerves and anticipation. The sky was still dark, with only the faintest hint of dawn bleeding across the eastern horizon. She'd barely slept, spending most of the night reviewing everything she'd learned about range safety protocols and shooting fundamentals. Kowalski was already there, standing beside his truck with a thermos of coffee and an expression that mixed approval and concern. "Wasn't sure you'd actually show up," he admitted as she approached. "I said I would," Isabel replied, accepting the cup of coffee he offered. Her hands were steadier than she'd expected. "Command approved this with conditions," Kowalski explained, pulling out a clipboard thick with forms. "You're officially listed as a civilian range assistant, not a full safety officer." You'll stay within 5 meters of me at all times, you'll observe and report but not make independent judgments, and if anyone objects to your presence, we pull you immediately. Understood? Understood, Isabel confirmed, signing the forms without hesitation. Good. Now let's go over the specific duties. For the next 30 minutes, Kowalski walked her through everything she'd be responsible for. Verifying weapons were cleared before soldiers left their firing positions. Watching for safety violations like improper muzzle discipline or finger placement. Ensuring shooters followed the commands for ceasefire and range cold. Keeping track of which firing positions were active and which were being reset. It was detailed, demanding work that required constant vigilance. Isabel absorbed every instruction, asking clarifying questions when needed, mentally rehearsing the protocols until they felt natural. By 5:30, other range staff began arriving, followed shortly by the first groups of soldiers scheduled for qualification. Isabel saw the moment they noticed her, saw the confusion and skepticism flash across faces as they registered the cafeteria workers standing beside Range Master Kowalski wearing a range staff vest. Lieutenant Brennan approached first, his usual coffee-at-breakfast friendliness replaced by professional concern. Kowalski, what's going on here? Is that Miller from the cafeteria? Miller is serving as civilian range assistant today, Kowalski replied calmly. She's been training for 3 weeks and has demonstrated proficiency with range safety protocols. She'll be under my direct supervision throughout the trials. With all due respect, sir, this is irregular, Brennan said carefully. The trials are high pressure, and we need experienced personnel managing them. Noted, Lieutenant. Your concern is logged. Now if you'll proceed to your assigned firing position, we're on schedule to begin in 10 minutes. Brennan's jaw tightened, but he moved away without further argument. Isabel could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on her, could hear the whispers spreading through the gathered soldiers. The cafeteria girl. Playing at being range staff. This should be interesting. Who approved this? Kowalski touched her elbow briefly. Ignore them. Focus on the work. That's all that matters today. The first group of 30 soldiers took their positions as dawn broke fully across the range. Isabel stood slightly behind Kowalski, clipboard ready, eyes scanning the firing line for any safety issues. Her heart pounded, but her hands remained steady. Range is hot, Kowalski announced through the loudspeaker system. Commence firing on my command. Ready. Aim. Fire. The synchronized crack of 30 rifles shattered the morning quiet. Isabel watched the shooters, noting their positioning, their trigger discipline, the way they handled their weapons between shots. She'd studied these exact movements for weeks, and now she was seeing them executed under pressure, with careers potentially hanging in the balance. One soldier in position 7 had his finger resting on the trigger guard between shots instead of straight along the receiver. Minor violation, but worth noting. Isabel marked it on her clipboard, then glanced at Kowalski, who gave her a subtle nod. He'd seen it too. The morning progressed in waves of controlled chaos. Groups rotated through their qualification courses every 45 minutes, with Isabel and Kowalski moving constantly along the firing line, observing, correcting, documenting. The work was exhausting and exhilarating, demanding complete focus and leaving no room for self-doubt. By the third rotation, Isabel had found her rhythm. She anticipated problems before they developed, caught safety violations that even some of the experienced range staff missed, and maintained detailed documentation that would be crucial for official scoring. Kowalski had stopped hovering quite so close, trusting her to handle routine observations while he managed the overall flow. During a break between groups, Captain Foster approached with an expression that suggested he'd been building up to this conversation all morning. Kowalski, a word? They stepped aside, but Isabel could hear every word of the tense exchange. She's doing fine work, Foster admitted grudgingly. Better than fine, actually. But people are talking. Some of the soldiers think it's inappropriate to have civilian support staff in a supervisory role during military qualifications. Those soldiers are welcome to file formal complaints, Kowalski replied evenly. Miller has demonstrated competence and professionalism all morning. Unless you have specific performance issues to cite, I'm keeping her on the line. Foster hesitated, then shook his head. No specific issues. Just wanted you aware of the optics. Noted, Kowalski said dismissively, returning to Isabel's side. You heard that? Hard not to, Isabel admitted. Good. Because here's what matters, you're doing excellent work. The complaints aren't about your performance, they're about people's discomfort with seeing someone exceed their expectations. Don't let it shake you. The afternoon brought the advanced qualification groups, including several soldiers who were attempting higher certification levels. The pressure intensified, with careers and promotion opportunities genuinely on the line. Isabel felt that pressure radiating from every shooter, saw it in their tense shoulders and careful movements. Davies was in the fourth afternoon group, and Isabel's heart sank when she saw his score sheet from the morning session. He'd barely passed the basic qualification, scoring just 2 points above the minimum threshold. For someone hoping to build a military career, it was a devastating performance. He looked miserable as he took his position for the afternoon advanced attempt, his usual cheerful demeanor completely absent. Isabel wanted to say something encouraging but knew it would be inappropriate given her current role. Instead, she simply ensured his firing position was properly set up and gave him a brief nod of acknowledgement. The advanced course began, and Isabel watched Davies struggle. His groupings were scattered, his shots inconsistent. After the first string of fire, he was already falling behind the pace needed to qualify. She could see frustration building in his posture, the way his shoulders tensed and his movements became jerky. Between firing strings, while other range staff were focused on scores and target verification, Isabel noticed something. Davies's sight appeared misaligned, the rear aperture slightly canted to the left. It was subtle, the kind of thing you'd only notice if you'd spent hours studying proper rifle setup. But it would absolutely affect shot placement, pushing every round slightly off target. She glanced at Kowalski, caught his eye, and gestured toward Davies's position. Kowalski moved closer, examined the rifle, and his expression tightened. He called a brief pause, approached Davies, and made the adjustment. The whole interaction took less than 30 seconds, but Davies's face flooded with relief and gratitude. The remaining strings of fire showed immediate improvement. Davies's groupings tightened, his confidence visibly grew, and when the final scores were tallied, he'd qualified for the advanced certification by 4 points. Not a huge margin, but enough. As the afternoon advanced groups completed their qualifications, an unexpected complication arose. One of the official range safety officers, Sergeant Hutchins, reported feeling ill and needed to leave immediately. The stomach bug that had decimated staff over the weekend was apparently still spreading. With 2 groups remaining and only 1 certified officer besides Kowalski, they faced a serious problem. We can't run the final groups with inadequate supervision, Captain Foster insisted. It's not just irregular, it's dangerous. We'll have to reschedule them for later this week. Those soldiers have been preparing for today specifically, Kowalski countered. Rescheduling will disrupt training cycles and create additional stress. We have adequate supervision if you count Miller. Miller isn't certified, Foster replied sharply. She's been helpful today, I'll grant you that, but she's not qualified to serve as primary range safety officer for qualification trials. He looked miserable as he took his position for the afternoon advanced attempt, his usual cheerful demeanor completely absent. Isabel wanted to say something encouraging but knew it would be inappropriate given her current role. Instead, she simply ensured his firing position was properly set up and gave him a brief nod of acknowledgement. The advanced course began, and Isabel watched Davies struggle. His groupings were scattered, his shots inconsistent. After the first string of fire, he was already falling behind the pace needed to qualify. She could see frustration building in his posture, the way his shoulders tensed and his movements became jerky. Between firing strings, while other range staff were focused on scores and target verification, Isabel noticed something. Davies's sight appeared misaligned, the rear aperture slightly canted to the left. It was subtle, the kind of thing you'd only notice if you'd spent hours studying proper rifle setup. But it would absolutely affect shot placement, pushing every round slightly off target. She glanced at Kowalski, caught his eye, and gestured toward Davies's position. Kowalski moved closer, examined the rifle, and his expression tightened. He called a brief pause, approached Davies, and made the adjustment. The whole interaction took less than 30 seconds, but Davies's face flooded with relief and gratitude. The remaining strings of fire showed immediate improvement. Davies's groupings tightened, his confidence visibly grew, and when the final scores were tallied, he'd qualified for the advanced certification by 4 points. Not a huge margin, but enough. As the afternoon advanced groups completed their qualifications, an unexpected complication arose. One of the official range safety officers, Sergeant Hutchins, reported feeling ill and needed to leave immediately. The stomach bug that had decimated staff over the weekend was apparently still spreading. With 2 groups remaining and only 1 certified officer besides Kowalski, they faced a serious problem. "We can't run the final groups with inadequate supervision," Captain Foster insisted. "It's not just irregular, it's dangerous. We'll have to reschedule them for later this week." "Those soldiers have been preparing for today specifically," Kowalski countered. "Rescheduling will disrupt training cycles and create additional stress. We have adequate supervision if you count Miller." "Miller isn't certified," Foster replied sharply. "She's been helpful today, I'll grant you that, but she's not qualified to serve as primary range safety officer for qualification trials." The first shot cracked out, surprising her slightly with its different recoil pattern compared to the rifle she'd trained with. Through the sights, she saw the hit marker appear in the 4th ring, outer edge. Not terrible, but not good enough if the pattern continued. She adjusted her sight picture slightly, compensated for the weapon's particular feel, and fired again. 3rd ring, better. Another adjustment. 2nd ring. She was finding the rhythm. The remaining 7 shots flowed in smooth succession, each one building on the feedback from the last. When the final round fired and she cleared the weapon, Isabel's hands were shaking with adrenaline, but her mind felt crystalline and clear. She'd done everything she could. Now it was up to the target. Kowalski walked downrange to verify the target while Foster and Isabel stood in tense silence. The seconds stretched interminably. Finally, Kowalski returned with the paper target, his expression unreadable as he handed it to Foster for official verification. Foster studied the target carefully, counting holes and measuring groupings. His eyebrows rose fractionally, the only indication of surprise. 9 rounds in the qualifying rings, 1 in the 4th ring outer edge. Total score of 82 out of a possible 100. Minimum passing is 75. He looked up at Isabel with an expression that mixed disbelief and grudging respect. "That's a passing score." "Barely, but passing." "And the safety protocols assessment?" Kowalski asked formally. "Perfect marks on all components," Foster admitted. "No errors, appropriate responses, proper procedures throughout." A long silence followed as Foster clearly wrestled with the implications. Finally, he pulled out his radio. "Command, this is Foster at the range. Requesting authorization for temporary civilian range assistant elevation to emergency safety officer status for completion of today's qualification trials. Assessment scores meet minimum standards. Awaiting your authorization." The radio crackled with static, then a voice Isabel didn't recognize responded. "Authorization granted for completion of today's trials only. Civilian Assistant Miller is authorized to serve as Range Safety Officer under direct supervision of Range Master Kowalski until all scheduled qualifications are complete. This authorization expires at 2000 hours today." Foster clipped the radio back to his belt and looked at Isabel with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Congratulations, Miller. You're officially a Range Safety Officer. For the next 4 hours, anyway." The final 2 qualification groups proceeded smoothly. Isabel moved along the firing line with confidence born from her morning experience and the validation of passing the assessment. She caught safety violations, verified proper procedures, and maintained the detailed documentation that military operations required. The soldiers she supervised showed varying degrees of surprise at her presence, but her competence was undeniable, and the grumbling she'd heard earlier in the day had largely subsided. Davies approached her during a break between groups, his face still showing relief from his afternoon qualification success. "I wanted to thank you, Officer Miller, for catching that sight issue. I'd been blaming my shooting when it was the equipment all along." "Just doing the job," Isabel replied, though the gratitude in his voice made something warm bloom in her chest. "And it's still just Miller. The officer part expires at 2000 hours. "Maybe," Davies said with a grin. "But for today, you earned it." The final group completed their qualifications as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Isabel's feet ached, her shoulders were tight with tension, and she'd consumed more coffee than was probably healthy. But as the last shooter cleared their weapon and the range was officially declared cold for the day, she felt a profound sense of accomplishment. Kowalski gathered the range staff for a brief debrief, reviewing the day's performance and any issues that needed addressing. When he reached Isabel's contributions, his tone was matter-of-fact, but the approval was clear. Miller performed at or above standards throughout the day. Her attention to detail prevented several potential safety incidents, and her documentation was thorough and accurate. She's authorized to continue in this capacity if she chooses. The words hung in the air like a door opening to a future Isabel hadn't imagined possible. 1 year after Range Master Kowalski had first invited her to the familiarization course, Isabel stood at the firing line during another qualification trial day. But this time, she wasn't a probationary assistant or emergency fill-in. She was a fully certified range safety officer, wearing the official insignia and carrying the authority that came with proven competence. The base had evolved in subtle ways over that year. More support staff attended weapons familiarization courses, inspired by Isabel's example. The rigid boundaries between military and civilian personnel had softened slightly, with recognition that capability mattered more than job classification. And Isabel herself had become something of a legend, the cafeteria worker who'd proven that potential existed in unexpected places. She still worked some cafeteria shifts, unwilling to completely abandon the work that had brought her to the base. But her primary identity had shifted. She was Range Officer Miller now, someone whose opinion carried weight, whose skills commanded respect. Davies, now a corporal after his successful qualification had led to promotion opportunities, approached her during a morning break. "You know what's funny," he said, accepting the coffee she brought from the cafeteria. "A year ago, I thought you were just the nice lady who made good cinnamon rolls. Now half the base considers you one of the best marksmen on the facility." "Markswoman," Isabel corrected with a smile. "And I still make good cinnamon rolls. I'm bringing some to the range office tomorrow." "That's what I mean though," Davies continued. "You didn't have to choose between being good at one thing or another. You just kept being excellent at everything you tried." The observation settled into Isabel's thoughts as she prepared for the afternoon qualification groups. She'd spent so much of her life believing she had to follow one specific path, that deviating meant failure. But the reality was more complex and more liberating. She could be both a skilled cook and a competent range officer. She could serve food and teach marksmanship. She could honor her grandmother's legacy while building something entirely her own. As the afternoon groups rotated through their qualifications, Isabel moved along the firing line with the confidence of someone who'd earned their place through demonstrated ability rather than credentials or connections. She caught safety violations, offered tactical corrections, and maintained the detailed documentation that kept operations running smoothly. Range Master Kowalski appeared beside her during a brief lull, his weathered face showing approval. "Command approved the expansion proposal. We're adding 2 more civilian range staff positions and developing a formal training pipeline. You'll be leading the instruction program." Isabel felt her breath catch. "Leading it? Who better? You've walked the exact path these new staff will follow. You understand what it takes to go from complete novice to certified professional. plus, you're patient, thorough, and you don't let people sell themselves short. He paused, then added quietly, you've changed this place, Miller. Made it better. Made us all think differently about what's possible. As the sun began its descent toward evening, painting the range in golden light, Isabel reflected on the journey that had brought her here. It had started with a joke, with a range officer casually handing her a rifle and expecting her to fumble. Instead, she'd discovered capabilities she'd never imagined, had refused to accept the limitations others tried to impose, had proven that being underestimated was only permanent if you accepted the assessment. The final qualification group completed their course, and Isabel verified the last of the documentation. Another successful day, another group of soldiers better prepared for whatever challenges they'd face. And tomorrow, she'd return to do it all again, serving breakfast in the cafeteria before heading to the range where she'd teach new students that potential wasn't about where you started, but about refusing to stop growing. She locked up the range office and walked toward her apartment as twilight settled across the base. In her bag was a letter she'd finally written to her grandmother, explaining how she'd found a different path than expected but one that honored the same values: precision, patience, dedication to excellence, and the courage to exceed everyone's expectations, including her own. Isabel Miller had been there to serve food, until someone jokingly handed her a rifle. That single moment had opened doors she'd never known existed, had revealed strengths she'd never recognized. And while she couldn't predict where this path would ultimately lead, she knew with absolute certainty that she'd never again accept anyone else's assessment of her limitations. The rifle range lights flickered on behind her, ready for tomorrow's training. And Isabel smiled, already looking forward to returning, to teaching, to continuing the journey of proving that the most powerful weapon anyone could possess wasn't made of metal and precision engineering. It was the absolute refusal to be defined by other people's expectations. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.